Thank you, Amanda. Welcome to you all. Let me start. I wondered whether we all had the same definition of infrastructure. So I was going to start with that. What is your definition of infrastructure? And what are one or two key things you've seen change in the last few years? Paul, can I start with you?
Yeah. So DWP's been on a bit of an interesting journey. So we've gone through a bit of a traditional insourcing route, and that's done the job it was meant to do. We saved hundreds of millions of pounds, and it's helped us take back control. So it's been really good in that respect. But the side effect is it's almost a capability journey that we've been on as well. So, it almost developing that capability in-house, hiring people, it's helped us go through a journey of adopting more open source because, as Amanda quite rightly pointed out, engineers get to choose more when we insource, and they tend to choose open source and cloud technologies. So for me, actually, when we talk about infrastructure, I almost think of people and capability that we have inside organizations as part of that infrastructure, which traditionally we don't. But I think that's, if anything, more important than some of the technical stuff that sits on top.
Thanks, Paul. I think that probably will be a theme. Richard, how would you define it, and what are the things that you've seen change recently?
Sure. Thanks for having me. So I work in the energy sector, which is an infrastructure sector, which is quite interesting because when we're talking about digital infrastructure, we're trying to get across quite a different concept from what most people think about in energy. What most people think about as infrastructure in the energy sector is very large engineering projects, and we're trying to talk about digital infrastructure to enable those very large engineering projects to be more efficient and deliver more value. So I think when we're talking about digital infrastructure, we're thinking about shared capabilities across the sector particularly, so not just platforms that benefit one company or one organisation. Things that give us policy and regulatory optionality within the energy sector. We've seen at the minute that actually being locked into one route for energy markets has been really challenging, so giving us that optionality. And then I guess building resilience and security. So having the ability to rely on more dynamic, flexible systems. And yeah, exactly. It's not just about the technology, but it's about the people, the capabilities, the capacity within government and private sector to be able to deploy digital solutions.
And Mike, how would you expand on that?
Well, I'm not sure I could. It's very good. I don't have a definition of infrastructure. I've learned the very hard way not to do that because everyone else's is different. So I just talk really about sort of stuff that gets things done. To answer the question about open source's impact on infrastructure and what am I seeing, I think that the interesting things are what signals are we seeing that we should see and shouldn't see. So if we think about the long-term change that open source should bring in terms of growth of teams, growth of engineers making thoughtful choices about the tooling that they use and indeed some of the outcomes that they provide and services that provide. I think what I'm seeing overall in the UK is the situation is much improved than it was a decade ago. I think sadly I'm seeing in some places, particularly health, in some areas reversion back to behaviours and processes that we tried to counter more than a decade ago. So overall I'm very optimistic, but I still think there's much work to be done. Outside the UK, the story is very different.
And you've all mentioned people and Mike, just picking up that point, things perhaps are reverting. What are the things that are important for us to hold on to that we have learned in that time?
I think it's, dear me, where to start? There's a long list of those. And I'm here today with a bunch of people, and we're talking about teams and skills and roles, and James's point that literally were barely present, and where they were present, they had to hide in government a decade ago. So the strides made have been tremendous. I think that, sorry, I've gone slightly off key. Can you just repeat the question?
That's okay. No, I just wonder, you said that some things were reverting back and we needed to keep hold of them. I was interested in
we need to keep
hold of
teams and people. That's what my point, sorry. My point was we need to keep hold of teams, we need to keep hold of people. There are sort of whole classes of people now, either employed by or used by or valued by the UK public sector in the wider sense that largely weren't not that long ago. And we've talked today, and Francis and James talked about the reasons why. So we need more than anything to hold on to teams. I think that one of my main concerns is what sounds like there's going to be yet more round of efficiencies, is that there is a sort of, my concern is that there'll be a sort of thoughtless move to sort of go back to very large IT purchases and all the whole stuff that we had a while ago in the name of savings and efficiencies. And I think that doubling down on teams right now is probably the most important thing. That's the thing that I spend an awful lot of my time doing at Public Digital and think about in terms of open source is, I think the real, for those of us who are not open source engineers, and God, no one's ever accused me of being a technologist, is actually to work on the finance function. I think the financing of UK public infrastructure and actually technology in the wider sense is the single biggest blocker to future reforms.
And you've all touched on open source, clearly, it's a context here, but you've also mentioned that you've all touched on things other than the technology. So if you look at where things are today, what have we got to learn from open source technologies, or all the whole community that we can bring into what we're doing today in public sector and wider? I'll start with Richard.
So specifically from the energy sector perspective, we found that there is a reliance on proprietary solutions, and that creates risk, and it means that things aren't interoperable, and actually you can't move that talent around as easily. And if we can adopt more of a open source approach, an open approach across many other areas, hardware and data as well, we build a little bit more resilience in the sector, we build ourselves that capacity, and we're able to better utilize the resources that are available. So purely in terms of like physical energy infrastructure, being able to have a battery that can be operated by different operating systems or different control systems is really important, because it means if a company that was running it goes bust, that asset isn't stranded, it's available to be reused by someone else, or it can be traded in different ways. And I think particularly when we're thinking about government investment in technical infrastructure and digital infrastructure, government are very good at mobilising innovation funding. We can do that quite effectively. We can really pump money into early stage interventions, but maintaining that and continuing to get that investment over time is really challenging, particularly where it is a single vendor solution and there is lots of issues around procurement rules and lots of issues around the funding might disappear in a few years' time because the government gets restructured and it moves in a different place. So being able to adopt more open approaches reduces that risk of investments being lost because we can't continue to maintain it, and it obviously makes sure that we're able to get better interoperability across things because people are able to deploy the same solutions. So from an energy sector perspective, we're really trying to push quite clearly to adopt open source where appropriate and in a sensible way, but particularly for that central digital infrastructure that underpins the sector, that's really where we think it has great value. Obviously with all the security caveats and making sure that we're doing it in the right way. But yeah, I think it just seems like the logical, sensible approach to me.
Well, do you see similar things around interoperability and reuse and the role that open source more broadly has?
I think so. I think open source's strength today is very much the same as it was 25, 30 years ago. When it started gaining traction. We come from a past where interoperability and integration between products, it was expensive, it was time consuming, it was difficult. Even the commercial models that we have in government, they don't favour innovation as a general rule. And open source, it gets around that almost by proxy. It allows you to pick something up quite quickly, it's cheaper at the point of use, it's open. And one of the major problems we've got in today's world, I mean, there's a phrase, or is an acronym, VUCA, I'm sure people are aware of, but that was coined 25 years ago in 1987, not 25 years ago, 35 years ago, sorry, in 1987 by the US military. It's volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. And actually, if you look back at 1987 and 2022, you just think you have no idea where you're going with this. But the way you deal with that VUCA world is act fast, test and learn, experiment, and open source fundamentally is the tool to do that with. It's easy to pick up, it's easy to use, it's open, you can build trust quite easily. It's not shrouded in secrecy like some of the old commercial arrangements and software and agreements that we used to have. My one concern is with the rise of the big cloud hyperscalers, is that the commercial model and the financials that underpin open source are at risk. Because if you look at what AWS is doing, you know, they'll take an open source project, they'll turn it into a platform as a service offering, and they won't pump money back into that project. And it's kind of, we need to get that balance right. It's done very well, open source, up until now. They understand where it's going. The funding model's been there to a certain degree. It could have been better, it could have been a lot better. I just worry that as we move more to that platform as a service world, that some of the revenue streams are going to dry up and some of the projects are going to struggle unless they're marquee ones. So that's what I worry about when I think of open source.
And a few people, you mentioned financing and the challenges. As you look ahead, what are the things that, from an infrastructure perspective, we need to take care of? Finance you've mentioned, talent, Mike, you mentioned. What are the other things that you think we've really got to be aware of, things that you see coming?
Well, from my point, I completely agree with that. There's a sort of stepping back moment. Talent, finance, all those things you've got to be looking at. But sort of question really is, where do you want to go with this now? Because I remember 30 years ago, I was an internet researcher and I was skint, obviously. So I got a job, part-time job, putting CDs on the old computer magazines, and we just put Linux on. I'm thinking, there's an operating system on a magazine, this is insane. And here we are 30 years later, and many people, I can't speak for everyone else, but many people, the sort of vision of what open source could be and how it could help and how it was so much better was still not changed. The question now is like, well, now what are you going to do with it? And we heard the figures from Jim before, like about how in the install base, the number of maintainers, the just importance of this now. And is it there now to be yet another sense of a set of public or semi-public good or a commons from which other, I won't say bad actors, but other actors then take extractive value? Is all this work being done so AWS can make yet more money? I'm not quite sure that was the real reason we got into this in the first place. Right, so when I say we need to muscle up financially, there's been, over the years, with a bunch of different challenges, sort of like the lobbying challenge, the security challenge, there's always been a challenge, I think, to the open source community, I mean that in the widest sense of like, you're not really professional, it's a sort of amateur hour, right? And some of that's been warranted at times, most of it's been rubbish, but the challenge now actually comes, I think, in a more nuanced way, from a sense of like, where are we going to go with this now? Did it just get picked off? And is it there, as I say, for that extractive financial value? I think one of the defensive moats that open source needs right now is a brand new financial model that is understood primarily by people who would not have a clue about most of the people in this room have a clue about, who are financial professionals, risk professionals in big institutions. The job is to get them informed quite quickly about the economic value, but also the downside risk of what happens in future. And I wonder for the first time if we need to, there was a sort of storytelling moment of saying, well, if you adopt open source, you'll get these benefits back in the 2000s in different sectors and in different functions. I think there's a need at an infrastructure level now, but also at most levels, to have that vision again. Where is this going? Why is that a good thing? Why should we not do some things that are now happening? And actually, if we continue doing some things, you mentioned AWS, but that's not the only one, what will happen then? And I think that our infrastructure, like we are at risk of saying, well, it's infrastructure, therefore the risks are security, or maybe a bit of talent in a key public institution. I don't think they are the only risks. I think the bigger risk is one of essentially maintaining a collective view about where this is going, because there's an implicit part of this which says, if you continue doing this, it's not just we want to make, if you take public sector, not just we want to make government better, we want to change its actual shape and size. That's the size of the prize here. We probably shouldn't do government in the way we're doing it in many ways, and we need to be probably explicit about that.
Yeah, there's lots of nodding heads. Richard, did you want to add anything from, you look at the whole of the industry from an energy perspective?
Yeah, loud. I completely agree with that, and I was just reflecting on some of the biggest challenges we're facing right now are collective challenges. Within energy and climate, no one actor can solve this alone, and there is a need to renew that community-style effort on some of these things so that we're able to build and scale and sustain these solutions going forwards. I think there's a number of big risks that are challenging that, not least the potential financial turmoil that is going on at the minute and risking private sector investment in things. We need to make sure that we're being sensible with where money is going so that we're getting the biggest benefit for it. And if energy can be investing in open source infrastructure to support energy projects, but then that has a wider benefit in other adjacent sectors, because many of the core infrastructure sectors have shared challenges and problems. I was in telecoms before I came to the energy sector, and they have the same sort of network type issues, but they're just maybe 5-10 years apart in terms of where their thinking is at in these areas. So I guess it's, whilst the political landscape, the state of the economy is changing over these years, the solutions, being community-based, being kind of collectively working on projects for the greater good, is still really important. And I guess it's working at how we make the right message, get the right messages to the right people to get the investment in those solutions that can benefit more widely.
And you've all got a lot of experience of doing this for real. So, and you talked, Paul, about insourcing, and we all talked about the future-proofing through community in general. So maybe you could sort of contextualise it and share some of the things that you've been working on and how you've been addressing those challenges in your own organisations. Talk a bit about what you've done at DWP, Paul.
Probably not enough. I mean, one of the biggest challenges we have is we went from this entire outsourced model where we were effectively supplier managers in IT through to we owned our own destiny, and that came at quite a heavy cost in terms of that initial build-up of capability. So we built a lot of technical debt into the estate. People going off and doing things that they perhaps shouldn't have done, building things that they shouldn't have perhaps have built. And it's led to a point where we're taking more of a platform engineering approach. So And that's not a technical thing, that's more of a sets of standards, policies, ways of working, infrastructure, tooling, the user experience, shared services, reusable components. So I've never been a big fan of doing that cross-government. I think it's unwieldy enough within one department the size of DWP, but I think there does need to have to be some structure, certainly to, honestly, I'm not a policy person, but there needs to be something there, cross-government, that says, and working with business, that says, you know, this is the way you should be using this stuff. These are the commercial things that you need to start thinking about. We need to probably have, with the hyperscalers, we've got one government cloud agreements and things like that. We probably need to do something along the same lines, maybe not at a commercial level, but at a policy level for the software itself and the components and libraries and all that good stuff. So there does need to be a lot more joined up thinking across government, which is never easy because it's like the biggest dysfunctional family you're ever going to meet. And you know, it's almost, if you look at departments, they're almost aligned with the social mission or the mission of the department itself. So you've got the culture almost mirrors that. So, you know, DWP is probably a lot more open. MOD is probably, you know, a bit more gung-ho and tightly coupled. So there does need to be some leadership probably from Cabinet Office, and I hate saying that, but probably from Cabinet Office.
Maybe that's an appropriate time to go to Mike and ask, but from your experience, what's your practical experience of what you've done to help with the challenges that you highlighted?
Get in the way a lot, probably. I think, Paul's on the two answers to that. Firstly, on the UK side, I think Paul's right. You need a controlling hand to some degree. Reputations notwithstanding, both personally and professionally, as in from an institution point of view, but at GDS, certainly for the last 3 years of a 5.5-year stint, more than half of my time was trying to get collaboration working via communities of practice, open events, sprints, just get people working together. I don't work in a government department, so I don't have the same internal culture and probably sort of departmental blinkers on that you need to do. Not criticism, you need to have that when you're working in somewhere. You need to be focused on DWP, right? I think the answer is quite simple. It's just leadership. It's a choice at the end of the day. There is absolutely no reason not to work together. It is a choice and it's a power system. Until we just speak openly about that, and let's just change that, but we don't want to, so let's stop moaning about it. And until then, you'll have a load of bad behaviour. So just change the power system, put the incentives in to share and operate. And I'd say, I've been saying that for 10 years, so it's not new news. That I think will now only happen externally. It will happen internally with people like Paul working with your colleagues across government because you're a good colleague and you'll do that. But until that leadership and power system is incentivised to do that, and as I say, that starts with the Treasury, it starts with the Green Book. So once we have that conversation, then we can talk about all the other behaviours that might follow. I think the more interesting point is while the UK, what was it described to me once, as a sort of a collection of argumentative public servants held together by a collective pension scheme. Whilst we continue to have these sort of departmental squabbles, which the further away from you are, just look utterly ridiculous. I thought they were ridiculous when I was in government. They just now look facile. What's happening outside of the UK, and probably this mirrors our wider position in the world, is fascinating. And the rise of digital public goods of a variety of sorts, but open source generally, is fascinating. With Aadhaar in India and other parts of the subcontinent, Novisi, MOSIP, a lot of these movements that are naturally coming from bottom up to either solve immediate problems, sometimes in COVID, or to solve sort of widespread societal dysfunction like identity payments and so on. That's the future. That's happening organically. All the characteristics of those things, by and large, are the same characteristics that the open source movement had when I was sticking CD-ROMs up front of magazines. You know, it's essentially bottom-up, mission-based, collaborative. There's a bit more money in it, I get that. But you're seeing a bunch of, the other thing you're seeing around the world is a bunch of politicians and government leaders going, actually, we'll invest in that by the time we'll invest our attention and invest our time and our political importance. We're not getting that here. Possibly COVID should have taught us that lesson, but it didn't. And I think that the impact on infrastructure outside of the UK is that public infrastructure will and is becoming more shared. I exclude China from this. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of other issues around technology there, but by and large, these very large public infrastructure and public, digital public goods phenomena mirror very much and encapsulate a lot of the open source movements and its impact on our political systems and our decision making. And I think that it was interesting to listen to Jim's figures about the number of collaborators we have in the UK and the effect of Europe. You know, we're good at that at an engineering operational level, and we're good colleagues. We're dreadful at it at a political level and at a sort of financial level. And that's where I think our focus needs to be. But that's coming at us very, very quickly. I mean, we're in the internet era. Things happen quickly. I have no idea since we started talking whether we have a prime minister. I don't know. But I turned my phone off a good 12 minutes ago, so who knows. But the point is that that's coming at us much more quickly than we think. And I have this sort of crazy position of going around the world, work with about 30 governments in public digital. And we see, by and large, some very simple things. They're going like, even if we wanted to do the wrong thing and buy loads of proprietary software for the next 20 years, we can't afford to anyway. So we're going to have to do something different. And by the way, we want to grow our engineering capability and our digital and our technology sector, and actually they're much more open to reusing other people's stuff. You know, one of the big challenges for DWP is not, frankly, people in Cabinet Office issuing edicts of this, that and the other. The bigger challenge for DWP and any big bit of government is how are we going to work with, what are we going to learn from and use from other benefit systems and other pension systems around the world when all our global finances have come together. By the way, I hope we are doing. You probably know. I have no clue. But the point is that the challenge is not just internal, how we organise ourselves. The challenge is very much external in a world of digital public goods. I think that world is absolutely fascinating. I've got huge amounts of optimism for what's happening there.
I can see Amanda nervous. We've got 5 minutes, so I'll move on to the last question, which you've teed up nicely, because it is about how do we use all of this how can other government organisations, government bodies, other countries benefit from this, learn and work together on this. Maybe, Mike, since you've teed that up so nicely, maybe you carry that on. And
I say this utterly seriously, put Paul in charge. And by that I mean put the people who are doing in charge of that. Because if the question is how do we get governments to work together, how do we work with Sina Lawson in Togo and her system that put in payments and health records for people in Togo in 18 days? How do we what do we learn from them? Firstly, let's have the humility to learn from them. They had SARS and MERS and they got there first. And then how do we learn from that? We have see Mr. Wardley here, we have no spatial awareness. We have no sort of sensors mapping what's going on in the world. And my concern for the UK is that we're still talking to ourselves. So collectively, how do we get those developers and those developers and engineers and all those open source people who are doing all this great work, how do we start listening and sharing with them internationally? I say that from a position of, as usual, almost complete ignorance, so I hope we are doing more, but I don't see enough of that. Because what I do see, particularly in South-South collaboration, is countries with specific needs. Look at Bangladesh, an enormous amount of societal and political problems, and yet Anir Chowdhury there has done absolutely a phenomenal job about sustaining and growing digital capacity and response to meet needs. And what are we learning from that? Not much. So what I want us to do as a country is stop arguing with ourselves about which department should have this, that, and the other, and actually be a better citizen in the world in terms of our collaboration with other governments and in the wider open source movement. And that collaboration should be led by people who know how to collaborate. Despite having no hair, I'm a hippie, and John Pastel famously put an RFC for let's set up how the internet works. I'd like us to be issuing more RFCs, say how should government work? And I'd like those RFCs to be coming from Paul and his colleagues in large parts of government who are doing the work, not from policy people who go on stages like me.
Mike, Richard, you see, you have a different perspective because you're not actually in government, but so what's your perspective on this about how we collaborate and learn, what others can learn, what we can learn from others?
Sure. I probably should have started at some point by explaining what on earth a Catapult is, but we were set up by government to help research and innovation, partly funded by government, but we do loads of research and innovation and commercial work as well. So I sit in this weird middle ground between industry and government, and we sort of sit on the fence a little bit between the two. And my favourite game is finding a new shiny innovation and taking it to government and saying, hey, look at this cool thing that we found. Estonia's transmission network operator for electricity have this amazing consent system where everyone's smart meter data just magically goes in and it's all interoperable and you can create loads of markets off the back of it. It's fantastic. It's all underpinned by the digital government work that the Estonian government were doing to put in the infrastructure to share that data across, and then they've leveraged that. So taking these brilliant proactive examples for problems that we have and solutions that we need, and being able to kind of show the breadcrumbs of, hey, look, that government invested in this stuff a little while ago, and now look what dividends that's paying in a different part of their organisation for a different reason. And I think every time we're able to kind of flag those great examples of where somebody has identified a problem and solved it, and particularly using open infrastructure in the middle, helps to strengthen the case that as a country we need to be investing in this. Because I think in general, people in government want to do the right thing. It's just it's really big and it's really unwieldy, and sometimes there's 3 teams trying to do the same thing and they don't know. And it's hard to collaborate when there's tens of thousands of people in different departments. So I guess leading by or showing great examples and helping people within government to build the case for doing the right thing.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel. I think some fantastic learning there. So please show your appreciation.
I probably don't need a mic, but for the sake of the camera, I'm going to join you, Stacey. So we did hope to have some questions, and we haven't allowed you any time for questions. We are at time, but did anybody have any pressing questions that they wanted to ask?
Thank you so much. One thing that's clear to me today is that a lot of the problems we've been talking about is about the lack of accountability in the supply chain. We've talked about risk from open source data, and we've talked about lots of other things. And Mike, you mentioned about the risk of big organisations benefiting from the commons and profiting off the back of this. And one of the most important commons we have is the planet and the carbon and sort of energy that we're putting towards what's good in the world. And I guess in terms of cloud, for example, there's no open source standards or data around carbon reporting. It's like trying to compare apples and pears and loads of different things. So what's the role of the UK government, the public sector and open source in trying to hold these tech companies to account and come up with those standards and really open up that conversation?
Mandation, probably take about half an hour. Political will, possibly talk to our colleagues in Europe about doing the same. It's not that difficult. It's about will. I mean, time and again, these very big issues come down to getting a very small number of people in the room and saying, do we actually want to do something about this? This is what we could do. I actually think that many of the market actors would probably welcome it. So I just don't, it's one of those crazy situations where the fear of doing it far outweighs the reality of itself. And it's about political will. As I say, probably they're not the best week to pick on politics as a hope for a source of a resolution to that.
It's very close to my heart. Like everything I'm trying to do is all about carbon and greenhouse gases. So there's multiple angles to it, but really trying to drive that interoperability and those standards that is going to enable data to flow through the supply chain, so we're able to capture all of the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for everything is going to be really important. And particularly if we want to not just decarbonise by offshoring everything, and steel, hey, ours is zero carbon, but there is zero of it. Well, that's not that helpful. We have to get that supply chain transparency in place. We've been pushing for that with government, but there are some political challenges right now, which means there are some alternative focuses in certain places. But I think trying to drive the digital interoperability really unlocks so much, because we are better than the global average in terms of carbon intensity for lots of things. And that would make the case for keeping things onshore, keeping the capabilities nationally. So I think it's really very important, and it's not that technically complicated. It's just someone has to say, we're going to do this, and kind of be able to bear the political challenges globally, not just nationally, because I think nationally it would be of help. Globally, it might be a slight challenge when the US say they don't want to do that. What do we do? Cut them out of the supply chain, or
It's consistency. It's pretty simple, really. We need to be able to compare apples with apples, not apples with oranges. And to Mike's point, it's not difficult, a lot of this stuff. It just needs somebody to sit down, create a standard, and make sure everyone adheres to it. And a lot of the hosting companies and the cloud hyperscalers, they're all doing this. It's just they're all doing it in different ways. So we're trying to glue all the data together. And of course, if the data is not consistent, it's really difficult to make decisions on. So good standards backed up with good policy around what we should be driving towards and how we should be utilising some of these things.
Write it down for them. Genuinely, just say, look, your decision is to say yes or no, do you want to do this? Because they're not, the policymakers, very senior policymakers and politicians are not going to get to grips with the detail of this. I think the job of this community is to actually create a sort of false binary where you go, do you want the world to go to ruin, or do you want to sign this piece of paper? I mean, it's not difficult, but you could argue that your policy officials can do that, but they have got quite a lot of other things to do. I think, as I say, it's so simple. It's almost a point where I wouldn't die waiting. Just get on with it.
Thank you very much.